Welcome to Stay Home, Stay Focused. I am Jack Moline. I'm president of Interfaith Alliance, and my very special guest today is my friend and former congressman from New Jersey, Rush Holt. He's also the former CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and we get to talk about both of those things. But first, Rush, the question I ask everybody when we start out, how are you doing?
Well, delighted to be with you. I'm doing well, seeing your smiling face and hearing your good-humored wisdom. Doing well. We've been largely insulated from the horror and the dislocation of the pandemic. My wife Annie and I are at our mountain retreat in upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains, where we can let the dog in and out as he chooses, and we can go hiking every day, and it's wonderful.
It's,
Um,
it's a
but
great
but
story.
it's
You were telling me
well,
that this was your boyhood summer camp.
I went away to sleepaway camp when I was 6 years old up here in the Adirondacks. The camp went out of business in the late 1970s. I was a graduate student. I didn't even have a home, but I bought a vacation home. And by buying the boys' camp and over the decades, then fixing it up. And so, it was just a vacation place. But now that I'm retired, I'm here quite a bit more between here and Washington, D.C.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And
And if I may turn the question
please,
back to you, how are
yeah,
you?
thank you, thank you. I am doing just fine. As the people who are viewing and listening know, I am in this spot every day for a number of hours, and just having the time of my life with these webcasts, because I've had the opportunity to visit with some dear friends and some important people, some of whom are the same, and we've been able to talk about things that are helping people stay focused rather than obsessing on washing their hands and keeping their family and loved ones safe. So, how are you maintaining that focus, Rush?
Well, when you invited me to be on your podcast, whatever we call this, your Zoom uh, instructional moment, to be focused, I felt inadequate. First of all, I feel a little guilty in that we are so well isolated here. As I say, I'm spared the horror and the dislocation that so many people are experiencing. Um, and focused is not a word that I or anyone else would apply to me in my life, usually. It's, years ago, I worked on Capitol Hill for Bob Edgar. You may know the name. He was a member of
Bob
Congress
Edgar,
for 6 terms. He was the head of the
absolutely.
National Council of Churches at one point. He was the president of Claremont Theological Seminary, a minister who was very much into social causes. But he had a apt way of describing various things. But one was he described a member of Congress himself, and later me, as a person who is a television on whom someone else has the remote control
Right.
and changes the channel every 10 minutes. So as it's a great description of a member of Congress, that you're going from subject to subject. Channel 6 and Channel 7 may be adjacent channels, but the subject matter is entirely different. The sense of powerlessness that somebody else is changing the channel leaves your day fragmented, unfocused, and so someone joked that if, as a member of Congress, if you didn't have um, attention deficit matters, you would develop them. Because it is indeed hard to stay focused. And if by focused you mean there's some central anchor, and your whole life builds out from that, your daily activities build out from that. That's not me. I'm a little scattered. My wife is during our isolation here. Annie's been doing a lot of jigsaw puzzles, and I've often thought, well, I'm not a bunch of concentric circles that with the bullseye in the middle, the focus in the middle. I'm more like a jigsaw puzzle with lots of different pieces to fit together, and you hope they fit together with a complete picture.
So you've taken the metaphor of your rabbi, Bob Edgar, and transformed it into your own Kabbalistic teaching. Very nice.
I suppose.
So
I do try. On your question, I do try to get some equanimity. A sense of calmness, I guess you'd say, in these times, and I do that with, kind of my science approach to life. I think we've all had a lesson recently that science is important. We need science. And with my kind of scientific thinking with respect to the virus, trying to understand, well, what it is, how it works, how it infects you, and what it isn't, it gives me not only something to do, but a sense of banishing imaginary fears. With science, you try to understand how things actually are, how the virus actually works. And that can be calming because it can banish, imaginary demons. Anyway.
So that's great. And it allows me to say at this point that when you were in Congress, you were the only physicist serving in the United States Congress. That was your path was through science. How did you wind up in public service as someone who had started down the path of science?
From my earliest memory, I have been interested in how the world works, that's science, and how people get along. I think that's politics. Now, you might think that's religion, but anyway, those two things I never thought were incompatible. Most people do. Most people think, most of my scientist friends say, well, politics, that's dirty and confused and not very solid or logical. Why would you want to do that? And my politician friends would say, well, science, mostly they say, oh, I could never do that, which troubles me terribly when people say, I'm not a scientist, I couldn't think that way. But I was always interested in both things, never saw any incompatibility. I got that maybe from my mother, who was a college biology teacher before my parents met. And after my father died, she went back to that for a year or two. But she was also a prominent politician and became the highest ranking woman in West Virginia state government, the first statewide official for a woman in West Virginia. She was Secretary of State of West Virginia and later did other things. So I never saw any incompatibility between science and politics. In the 7th grade, I had my own subscription to both Scientific American and the Washington Post. So that's.
And it's worth mentioning that your father was a United States Senator also from West Virginia. And
The youngest ever elected. And to this day, Joe Biden was elected before he was 30 years old, but he turned 30 before his swearing in January. My father didn't turn 30 until 6 months after the normal swearing in. So he had to wait before he could take his seat. It was an interesting time. This was in the middle of the New Deal. Interesting days.
It's a great legacy. So you've sort of answered the question of how you got inspired to both of these things. You come by both your scientific inclination and your political inclination, honestly. But my experience in talking to people who go into public service is that there's always some issue or set of issues that motivates them to take that first step. What were yours?
It was a variety of things. I mean, some of it as simple as competitiveness. When I saw an open seat that no Democrat thought they could win. And I looked at it and I said, I think a Democrat could win this. I think I could do it. So there was a little bit of that competition. There was also a motivation in that what was dominant in Congress at the time under the recent leadership of Newt Gingrich was a bashing of Congress, a denigration of government, of the idea of government. And I found that offensive. People making careers in government, bashing government. And so I was determined to do something about that. It was also, I have something of a religious background, not much to talk about, but, if people ask me for your motivational biblical passage, and it is when Peter was asked, who is this person that you call your leader, your Messiah? And he said, well, Jesus went about doing good. And that was his description of Jesus, and driving out the demons that people had. And, so I've always felt that everybody has an obligation to go about doing good, not just think good thoughts, not just be ethical within yourself. And, politics is that application, applied ethics, so to speak. And there are other motivations, but that's some of it.
So, and you championed a lot of causes during the decade and a half that you spent in Congress. The one that was most fascinating to me, I hope you remember this because you weren't able to get it to go anywhere, but I was just
that could be any
thrilled
number
by
of
it.
things. Go ahead.
No, you wanted regulation of voting standards and voting machines during all elections in the United States. There was an origin to that.
Would you say I was right to think that we should have reliable, auditable voting?
Yeah, I would say you were right. I'm not sure every member of every foreign government would say you were right.
That's right. Well, and in fact, some of our own people. And I tried as soon as, well, in the year 2000, which was the election of hanging Chads and pregnant Chads and recounts and disputed ballots. Congress was motivated a year or so later to pass the Help America Vote Act. And the Help America Vote Act gave states voting procedures that are clear, simple, easy to use, and totally unauditable and unreliable. States got these voting machines where your vote disappeared into an ether and you never knew whether it was recorded the way you intended it to be recorded. And because it was a secret ballot, no one else could ever know whether it was recorded the way you wanted it recorded. And so I tried to change that without success for year after year after year after year in Congress. And now I think most people would say, gee, in fact, one leader in Congress said, Rush tried to tell us this. And I didn't remind this leader that they blocked me from doing it. So not that they didn't get around to doing it, they blocked me in doing it.
Yeah, I guess the next best thing to success is vindication. So
that's right. Yes.
So you talked about how frustrated you are that people sometimes see politics and science as being opposing vocations rather than complementary ones. People say the same thing about religion and science. What role does faith play in the life of a scientist? And I guess the other question is, what role does science play in the life of a person of faith?
Yeah. Well, what role does faith play in the life of a merchant or a farmer or a candlestick maker? There is nothing, I would argue, antithetical to a scientist having faith and being a person of faith. and being a person of religiously motivated social action and so forth. They are different aspects of knowing. Religion is one way of knowing. But if you want to know about the empirical world, this idea of thinking that is now half a millennium old has proved to be the most reliable way of understanding how things actually are in an empirical way. And, to be whether it's to make policy or to guide your life, science isn't the answer. You also need ethics and humane thinking and faith, and there are a number of other ingredients. But the starting point should be an understanding of how things actually are, and that's for the empirical world. That's what science has proved to be the best way of knowing that. And so I wish in making public policy and in dealing with viral pandemics or any number of other things, everybody would realize that this idea of asking for evidence and using the evidence as your starting point to understand how things actually are, so then you can apply your values and your ethics and your other principles that you apply to make the decisions and make the policy, we'd all be better off. But so many people say, well, I can't understand science. I was never a good science student. Anyone can ask about evidence. It is a very democratic, small d, a very democratic thing. It's the opposite of aristocracy. It's the opposite of arrogance. If you let evidence be the arbiter of differences of opinion, and that's good for democracy. That's good for living in a viral pandemic.
There are so many challenges to science today, and some of them masquerading themselves as science. Amateur opinions on the effectiveness of certain chemical compounds, or on the epidemiology studies that show how a virus transmits. Is science respected in our society today, or has it gone the way of what motivated you to object to Newt Gingrich and his disregard for government?
Well, I mean, that's a real good question. I think appreciation of science has diminished. I think historically, our country is empirically grounded. The framers of the Constitution valued the idea of experiment, where you would gather the evidence and then make those decisions and judgments on the basis of the evidence. What we've seen from the coronavirus is that it's not that we need more scientists doing good work in virology and immunology and epidemiology and so forth. What we need to understand is that having a cohort of skilled, accomplished scientists is no substitute for an engaged public. A public that doesn't say, well, we'll leave the science to the scientists. We won't think about science. We won't try to use evidence to separate opinion from fact. We will let all opinions, let a thousand opinions bloom. And we won't imagine that there's any way of separating one from another. Um, and that's what's happening there is not just a diminishing of respect or appreciation for science, but what would I say? Um, by relegating science entirely to the scientists, it's an abdication of each person's personal responsibility, and I would say actually joy in um, getting the evidence, and evaluating it.
Rush, this 20 minutes has flown by, and I miss even more the opportunity that we used to have every week to talk when we would meet in a group through the Faith and Politics Institute. So this only motivates me now to be more in touch, even though you're inching toward Canada up there. Thank you so much for being with us. I know you're missed in the House. I know you're missed in your district. And you have done a great service for those who are viewing and listening today. So thanks for being with us. And to those
Thanks,
of you
Jack.
on the other
Great to
end
be
of the
with you.
screen, stay home and stay focused.